My name is Natalie Grace Thompson, and I am 30 years old. When I got pregnant at 22, my world shattered, not because of the pregnancy itself, but because the people who were supposed to protect me turned their backs completely. They kicked me out, humiliated me, and told me I had ruined our family. And yet, years later, I would rise in a way they never saw coming. If you've ever felt betrayed by the people you trusted most, this story will hit deep. Hit that like button if you've ever had to fight for your own survival, and subscribe to hear more stories of ultimate justice. And hey, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city and local time in the comments. I was 22 when my life truly began to unravel, though at the time I didn't know it. I had spent the first 22 years of my life living in the shadow of expectations I had never chosen, wrapped tightly in a cocoon of obedience that I mistook for love. I had been the quiet, dutiful daughter, the one who never argued, the one who smiled when my brother took the spotlight, the one who carefully folded her dreams and tucked them away because my parents had always made it clear, the family comes first. Individuality, they had said, was dangerous. Too much hope, too much ambition, and I would find myself lost. Their house wasn't warm. There was no smell of home-cooked meals, no lingering aroma of fresh bread or cookies. Instead, every room smelled faintly of lavender air freshener, sterile and controlled, as if a pleasant scent could mask the tension that clung to every corner. Every conversation was measured, every smile calculated. I learned early that a misplaced word or a dream too loudly spoken could become a weapon used against me in subtle, unforgiving ways. I was the daughter who fit neatly into the puzzle they had built. Quiet, compliant, small. I remember the exact day I found out I was pregnant. It was a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, when the sunlight slanted through the blinds of my tiny bedroom, painting stripes across the floor. I sat on the edge of my bed, a tiny plastic stick clutched in my trembling hands. Joy, fear, panic, they collided inside me like a storm. I had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsing how I would break the news, how I would explain the miracle growing inside me, how they might, just maybe, embrace me with love instead of judgment. But the reality shattered every expectation. I remember walking into the living room, holding the test as if it were a fragile piece of glass. My mother looked up from her knitting, and in that moment, her expression shifted. Her face went pale. Not the gentle kind of pale that comes with surprise, but the bone-draining, lifeless pale that sucked warmth from everything around her. My father, seated in his chair with the newspaper folded neatly in front of him, didn't even look up at first. Then, slowly, his eyes darkened, as though a shadow had passed over them, thick and suffocating. "You've ruined everything," he said. The words were sharp, deliberate, and surgical, cutting me down to the marrow. "Do you understand what this does to the family name? Do you even realize the embarrassment you've caused?" I opened my mouth to speak, to plead, to explain that this wasn't a mistake. It was life. It was love. It was mine. But the words faltered. My mother leaned forward, her eyes cold, her voice brittle. "You don't get to need anything," she said. "You should have thought of that before making this mistake. Now you are on your own." I remember my legs shaking as if they were made of something other than flesh and bone. My mouth moved, but no sound came out. And then, as if the weight of abandonment wasn't enough, they delivered the final blow. "You need to leave," my father said. "Pack your things. You are no longer welcome here." I was 22, alone, afraid, and, in a single sentence, everything I had ever known had crumbled beneath me. Outside, the late afternoon sun was fading, spilling dull gold over the meticulously manicured lawn that I had spent so many years walking across, learning how to hide, how to conform, how to be unseen. That lawn now belonged to people who had just told me I was a mistake, a burden, a disappointment. I sat on the front steps, clutching my small suitcase, tears streaming down my face, my chest tight with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How was I supposed to survive? I had no plan, no safety net, no one to turn to. And yet, amid the fear, amid the crushing sense of betrayal, there was a tiny, stubborn spark deep within me. I may have been abandoned, but I was not broken. Raising my son alone was a nightmare I wouldn't wish on anyone. Nights bled into mornings in a blur of crying, worry, and exhaustion so complete it left my body screaming in ways I hadn't known possible. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, barely catching enough hours to cover rent, food, and the never-ending tide of necessities. Every day was a battle, feeding him, protecting him, keeping a roof over our heads, and trying, desperately, to carve even a small space for myself and my dreams. I can still remember the nights when the house was silent, except for the soft whimpers of my son in his crib, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind a tangle of questions I had no answers for. Why had my parents turned their backs on me? Was I not their daughter? Did I not deserve a chance at happiness, at love, at support? The questions came, relentless, and the silence answered nothing. I cried quietly, fearing that even the sound of my despair might reach him, might awaken him to the tremor of my fear. The world did not soften for me because I was a young, single mother. Landlords saw my desperation as weakness. Employers ignored my talent and ambition. Friends vanished when the reality of my struggle became apparent. I learned very quickly how to survive, not just how to endure, but how to navigate a world that seemed built to crush the unprepared. I learned to smile when I wanted to scream, to nod when I wanted to shout, to hold my sobs back when someone casually asked, "How are you?" It was during those quiet nights, when the house was finally still and the hum of the city faded, that I made a promise to myself. I would rise. Not immediately, not for revenge, not yet, but for my son, for the flicker of life within me that refused to be extinguished. I would build a life so strong, so unassailable, that no one could touch it, not even the people who had abandoned me. Even then, their voices haunted me. "You've ruined the family. You're a disgrace." I carried those words like stones in my chest. Every misstep, every failure, felt magnified under their imagined scrutiny. But slowly, painfully, I realized the power they held over me only existed if I allowed it. And I could not. I began to educate myself in stolen moments. While my son slept, I read books about finance, marketing, business strategy. Everything I could find that promised a roadmap out of dependence and despair. I studied while cooking, while folding laundry, while rocking my son to sleep in the middle of the night. I saved every penny I could, made connections wherever possible, and started building a foundation that existed only in my mind and in the quiet persistence of my actions. The first year was the hardest. Instant noodles became a staple, hand-me-down clothes a necessity, and sleep a rare luxury. I walked to work through rain and cold, my son's small hand in mine soaking wet, my heart heavy but determined. Each day I pushed a little further, refusing to ask for help, refusing to lean on anyone. I was no longer a frightened girl. I was a mother, and a mother fights. By the second year, small victories began to accumulate. A freelance contract here, a small sale there, moments that made my chest swell with pride and a sense of self I had never known. Slowly, the whisper of a new identity emerged. The identity of someone who could thrive without anyone else's permission, without anyone else's approval. I began to feel the first glimmer of a storm that would one day change everything. I could rise. I could shine. I could become someone untouchable. Someone whose life could not be diminished by those who had once sought to control me. And yet, the pain never fully left. The sting of betrayal, the ache of their absence lingered like a phantom. Every cold glance, every closed door, every challenge in the world outside reminded me of what had been taken from me. But those reminders no longer weakened me. They fueled me. Every hardship became a stepping stone, every tear a sharpening edge. By the third year, I had built momentum. My business ideas, once whispered in secrecy and scribbled in worn notebooks, began to take shape. Small clients became repeat clients. I learned to negotiate, to network, to present myself with confidence I had never been allowed to possess. And through it all, my son grew. I watched him laugh, stumble, fall, and rise again, and I saw in him the reflection of the resilience that had saved me. Every step forward was both an act of survival and a quiet rebellion. I began to imagine a future so vivid and undeniable that it became a living force, pushing me to new heights. And in those moments, I understood something profound. Revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, it builds, it quietly gathers power while the world remains unaware. And when it finally arrives, it is devastating precisely because it is subtle, inevitable, undeniable. I could still hear their voices, those sharp echoes of judgment and rejection, and I let them linger only long enough to remember why I had begun. Then I turned them into fuel. I reminded myself that my success would not be loud, not ostentatious, not designed to humiliate. It would be elegant. It would be undeniable. It would be the kind of life that left no room for doubt, no room for argument, no room for the poisonous influence of those who had once sought to control me. By the 4th year, the foundation I had built became visible even to others. Freelance work grew into contracts into a fledgling business, and slowly, the small, persistent flame of independence became a roaring fire of self-sufficiency. Every penny saved, every sleepless night endured, every humiliation borne in silence became a brick in the fortress I was constructing around my life. I was no longer a frightened, obedient girl. I was a woman who had taken control, a mother who had transformed desperation into triumph, a person who had learned to wield pain as power. I think back now to that day on the front steps, suitcase in hand, heart hammering with fear and disbelief. I was terrified. I was alone, and yet within me was the spark that refused to die. It has carried me across years of struggle, across nights of hopelessness, across moments where giving up seemed the easier path. That spark has grown into an unrelenting force that shapes every decision I make, every risk I take, every boundary I set. And one day it will meet them, not with anger, not with loud proclamations, but with a calm, unstoppable reality that speaks louder than words ever could. Because the truth is, the most devastating revenge is not in shouting, not in pointing fingers, not in dramatics. It is in living a life so extraordinary, so radiant, so self-made, that those who tried to diminish you are left speechless. That day will come, and when it does, I will be untouchable. Not just for myself, but for the small, stubborn flicker of life that I brought into the world and protected with everything I had. I will be untouchable, and I will have done it alone. Little did I know, the path from a terrified, abandoned girl to a self-made millionaire would be filled with nights darker than I ever imagined, and moments of temptation to give up entirely. The real struggle, the fight for survival and eventual triumph, was only just beginning. The years that followed were nothing short of a relentless test, a constant trial of endurance, strength, and willpower that seemed designed to break me at every turn. I still remember that first winter after being cast out, the first time I truly understood what it meant to be utterly alone. The small apartment I had managed to scrape together rent for was barely habitable. Its walls were thin, its pipes groaned with age, and the heat barely made it above freezing. I would wrap my son in 3 layers of blankets, feeling the weight of his small body against mine as I shivered in my own threadbare coat, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the windows, howling like some ominous reminder of my isolation. Every night I would sit in that dark, cold kitchen, sipping lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, my hands trembling not merely from the cold, but from exhaustion, from fear, from the gnawing anxiety that I would fail him. That fear, so raw, so unrelenting, was compounded by another deeper terror, the fear that my parents had been right all along. "You've ruined the family." Their words echoed in my mind like a relentless mantra, and for months I found myself whispering them over and over, wondering if perhaps they contained some hidden truth. I won't sugarcoat it. There were mornings I woke up wishing I could simply vanish, to disappear entirely, leaving behind the crushing weight of responsibility that pressed on me like a physical force. Some mornings I would hold my son close and imagine a world where he had a family that loved him unconditionally, a family that offered comfort instead of rejection, warmth instead of cold judgment. The ache in my chest during those moments was so sharp, so piercing, that I feared it might split me in two. And yet, in those fleeting moments of despair, a stubborn fragment of resolve would surface. If I broke, he broke too. I could not, would not, allow my weakness to dictate the life of the small, fragile being I had sworn to protect. Work became both my lifeline and my cage. A paradox I felt every single day. I would rise before dawn to study or prepare breakfast for my son, then head to a local diner where I waited tables from early morning until mid-afternoon. From there, I would move on to delivering packages, my body aching under the weight of boxes, the chill of the wind biting through my thin jacket. Nights were reserved for freelancing online, typing, organizing, designing, calculating, often until 2 or 3 in the morning, my eyes burning, my fingers cramping. The body, I learned quickly, could endure far more than I had ever imagined. Dark circles became permanent companions under my eyes. Calluses formed on my hands from the constant strain of writing and lifting, and my shoulders carried a tension that no massage or sleep could fully dissolve. My son, blissfully unaware of the sacrifices that sustained our survival, would sometimes tug at my sleeve and ask for ice cream or a new toy. My heart clenched every time. I wanted to give him the world. But the world I had in those days was barely enough to keep the lights on, barely enough to protect him from the harshness of reality. The social stigma of being a single mother in my community added yet another layer of difficulty. Whispers followed me down streets. Eyes lingered just long enough to make me uncomfortable, and acquaintances who had once nodded politely now crossed the road to avoid even passing me. My parents' friends, distant relatives, neighbors, all seemed to judge me not for my choices, but for circumstances I had never asked for and could not control. It felt like the universe itself had conspired to remind me at every turn that I was, in their eyes, a failure. These subtle judgments were sharp, corrosive, invisible, but unmistakably present. Every step outside my apartment became a test of courage, a reminder that my fight was not just against survival, but against a world that had already written me off. And yet, amidst the despair, tiny sparks of hope began to flicker. My first freelance client was a small business owner in the neighborhood, someone who needed help managing inventory and organizing online orders. The pay was modest, almost laughably so, but the sense of validation was enormous. Someone believed in me. Someone recognized my capability, my potential, my skill. That validation became addictive, and for the first time in years, I felt a subtle shift inside. A quiet stirring of confidence, fragile but undeniable. I began to understand that survival alone would never suffice. It could only sustain me, not free me. Freedom, I slowly realized, required strategy, precision, and relentless self-education. I needed skills, knowledge, and connections that would elevate me beyond scraping by. Late nights became my classroom. Early mornings became a laboratory for planning. Accounting, marketing, business strategy, investment, all became lifelines, lifeboats in a storm that showed no signs of relenting. I absorbed knowledge like a dry sponge drinking in water, often memorizing entire chapters while my hands rocked a sleeping child, listening to his quiet breaths, letting him anchor me while I built a path toward independence. Setbacks, of course, were inevitable. Small disasters would arrive like cruel reminders of my fragility. A client would vanish without payment. A delivery route would be reassigned to someone younger and faster. Landlords would threaten eviction for minor mistakes. Each setback sank my heart for a moment, but rather than succumbing to despair, I learned to transform each failure into a sharpening tool. I learned resilience, patience, and the subtle art of recalibrating quickly. Fail gracefully, rise again with precision, I told myself. That became my mantra. Each time the world sought to crush me, I grew just a little stronger, just a little smarter, just a little more relentless. Isolation became a bitter companion. College friends drifted away, uncomfortable with the reality of my circumstances, unwilling to witness struggle so raw and unrelenting. Romantic relationships became impossible to sustain. How could anyone comprehend a life dominated by responsibility so profound? Comfort could not be found in others. I had to find it within myself. My support system became my mind, my planning, my small victories, and of course, my son. Together we were all I had, and together we were enough. There were nights when doubt struck like a physical blow. Am I strong enough? Am I smart enough? Will I ever escape the long shadow they cast over me? Tears would fall silently, soaking my pillow as my body shook with quiet sobs. No one would hear, no one would come to console. And yet each time I whispered to myself, "You will survive. You will rise, not for them, not for anyone else, but for you and for him." And then, almost imperceptibly, a transformation began. I started noticing patterns in the world around me. I realized how small investments could grow exponentially, how businesses expanded when guided with care, how the right connections created doors that had seemed permanently locked. Though my parents had tried to crush me, their cruelty inadvertently gifted me an extraordinary freedom. No one could manipulate me. No one could dictate my worth. No one could define my limits. I was untethered. I had nothing to lose. And that, I discovered, was a kind of power most people never truly grasp. I remember one evening vividly. My son was asleep in his crib, his soft breathing the only sound besides the hum of the refrigerator. I was seated at our tiny kitchen table, surrounded by a chaotic pile of textbooks, notebooks, and scribbled notes. The smell of burnt toast from dinner lingered in the air, a reminder that even in our modest existence, life went on. I had been crunching numbers, calculating potential profits for a small online store idea, my hands moving automatically, my mind racing. And then it struck me, fully and irrevocably. I can do this. I can actually do this. I don't need anyone's approval. I don't need my parents' permission, their validation, or their acceptance. I can carve a path, however narrow, and it will lead to something extraordinary. From that night onward, survival was no longer enough. Planning became the essence of life itself. Each hour of work, each page read, each connection made was a brick in a foundation I was determined to build. The people who had once cast me aside, who had told me I was a disgrace, had no idea that I was quietly laying the groundwork for something monumental, something unassailable. The path was far from smooth. There were nights when my body refused to cooperate, when illness struck, when exhaustion overwhelmed me, and sleep claimed me mid-task. Financial crises arrived like cruel tests, forcing impossible decisions: pay rent or buy food, save for the fledgling business or cover a medical emergency. Each time I chose resilience. Each time I reminded myself, I am building more than survival. I am building a life, an empire, a future no one can take from me. Independence, I discovered, carried a quiet, intoxicating joy. The first time I paid for something without asking anyone, without guilt, without shame, the exhilaration was overwhelming. The freedom of knowing that no one could control my life, that no one could dictate my choices, that no one could touch what I had fought for. This became a force I drew upon endlessly. And even as I celebrated these small victories, the memory of my parents' rejection remained a quiet fire inside me. "You've ruined the family," their words echoed, a shadow that pushed me to outwork, outthink, and outlast every obstacle. Yet the vision of revenge, though present, remained hazy, a dream glimpsed through fog. The reality was daily grind, constant struggle, a delicate negotiation between despair and determination. Each day was a battlefield, each small win, a victory against the world, against circumstance, against the lingering ache of betrayal. Over time, I noticed subtle transformations in how I was perceived. Confidence, I realized, was a silent power. It did not demand attention, did not shout for recognition. It simply existed, shaping perception without fanfare. Small business owners, clients, colleagues, they sensed it. I was no longer to be underestimated. That quiet influence, almost invisible, was the first seed of control I had ever wielded in my life. Then, unexpectedly, life reminded me of the cruel irony of existence. One night, at a local gathering, my old high school neighbor mentioned my parents casually. "Oh, Natalie's parents? They're so proud of her now," they said lightly, almost laughing. "They talk about her all the time. She's doing so well. Can you believe it?" My heart froze. My chest tightened. A part of me wanted to explode, to correct them, to spill the truth of sleepless nights, endless struggle, and abandonment. But a quieter voice whispered, "Not yet. Let them talk. Just watch." And in that moment I understood something profound. The power had begun to shift. Though I had been struggling, suffering, scraping by, I was ascending. My parents' words, their attempts to define me, to shame me, were losing their hold. The life I was building, my son's future, my independence, my quiet, unstoppable rise, was mine alone. And one day, they would see the result of their cruelty. They would understand. without any explanation, without a single word from me, exactly who had the upper hand. The journey ahead remained arduous, but the fear had changed. It no longer paralyzed me. It became fuel. Every hardship, every moment of isolation, every financial strain, every sleepless night. These were no longer chains but stepping stones. Each small victory, each calculated move, brought me closer to a life that was no longer defined by anyone else's expectations or judgments. I was no longer a child to be molded, a mistake to be discarded. I was the architect of my destiny, quietly, patiently, relentlessly building a world where my son and I could thrive, and where, someday, those who had abandoned me would witness the full measure of what they had tried to destroy. I was still far from the $12 million empire I would one day control, still enduring sleepless nights and endless struggle, but the first seeds of something greater had been planted. And as I sat at that kitchen table, staring at my son sleeping peacefully, I began to form a plan, not just for survival, but for a life so triumphant that the people who abandoned me would wish they had never crossed my path. By the time I was 26, something in me had shifted so profoundly that my reflection in the cracked mirror of my kitchen looked like a stranger I was only just beginning to understand. Years of scraping by, of patching together tiny wins and swallowing indignities, had honed me into someone both familiar and unknowable, resilient in ways my younger self could not have imagined, cunning where I had once been naive, and unyielding in the face of obstacles that used to break me. I had a modest but stable apartment, a network of clients, and a small but growing business that could reliably cover rent, groceries, and the occasional luxury I permitted myself. A dress chosen because it made me feel like someone who belonged somewhere. A quiet dinner at a restaurant when the payroll was steady. A little treat for my son when his eyes lit up with simple joy. Those comforts were earned, and they mattered. But beneath them a restlessness lived that felt less like dissatisfaction and more like a low, insistent drumbeat. I wanted more. Much more. That drumbeat sharpened into clarity on a day that seemed ordinary at the time. I had been invited to speak at a local seminar for women in entrepreneurship. The venue was modest, a community center room with folding chairs and a modest podium, but to me it felt like permission to stand in full view and tell my story out loud. I prepared not because I craved attention, but because my history of small, steady choices was a map someone else might need to see. When I stood at the lectern and spoke about resilience, strategy, and the lessons learned from failure, I did so with a voice tempered by experience. I spoke of late nights, of deals salvaged and contracts won through persistence, of the emotional labor of being a single mother in an economy that rarely offered mercy. The audience listened, their faces gentle in the half-light, and when I finished the applause felt like warmth on a winter hand. It was then that I saw a familiar silhouette in the crowd. My mother. She had arrived unannounced, her hair styled perfectly, her posture immaculate, the kind of outward polish that had always been her armor. Her presence felt like a stage prop suddenly moved into place. She materialized in the doorway as if to claim a front-row seat in the narrative of my success. After the seminar, she approached with the practiced smile I knew well, an expression that had once convinced me of the sincerity of compliments and the value of approval. "Natalie, darling," she said, every syllable measured and smooth, "we're so proud of you. Everyone is talking about how far you've come." I accepted her words with the polite smile I had rehearsed 1,000 times over the years. Inside, something tightened. This was the woman who had not stayed through the nights of my deepest pain, who had not taken my son so I could sleep, who had not offered practical guidance or financial support when scarcity bit the hardest. Her sudden basking in my accomplishment felt like theft, taking credit for a life she had not lived. I remembered 1,000 small absences, the ways she had learned to perform empathy without ever offering hands-on help. But alongside that indignation, a quieter realization settled in. Her approval no longer had the power to make me small. Where once her words might have coerced me into gratitude and obedience, now they ricocheted off the fortified self I had built. The liberation in that was startling. For the first time, I felt the pleasure of being unaffected by what had once defined me. It was a small revolution. The knowledge that their voices were not the final arbiters of my worth. From that day, My approach shifted from survival to strategy. I refused to let instinct alone run my life. Instead, I began to plan with the precision of someone who treats ambition like a craft. I read voraciously about markets and trends, studied pricing and margins until the numbers no longer intimidated me, and learned to think in portfolios rather than paychecks. I began to dissect the human dynamics around me, the mechanics of pride, the blind spots of entitlement, the predictable ways people responded to flattery or perceived leverage. My parents' arrogance and casual dismissals, once wounds, now served as a curriculum, how not to behave, and an actual blueprint for how to maneuver in a world that prized appearances more than substance. I expanded my nascent online business with intentionality. What began as a small shop selling carefully curated home goods grew into a diversified venture: e-commerce, consulting services for small brands, and cautious investments in local real estate. Every dollar of profit was treated like seed capital. I reinvested with patience, refusing quick gratifications for longer, sturdier wins. I negotiated with suppliers, refined my brand's voice, and learned the language of contracts until those once intimidating legal clauses became comfortable tools. Each step forward felt like a lesson learned in the school of scarcity. The path was uneven. There were nights when fear returned with a vengeance, when an unpaid invoice seemed terminal, or when a pitch was met with silence. I remember, in particular, a confrontation with a client who tried to extract more value than they were willing to pay for. My pulse raced. The memory of former helplessness tempted me to take the deal simply to keep the cash flowing. Instead, I produced a calm, firm response, a clearly itemized scope, evidence of past results, and a non-negotiable statement of what fair compensation would look like. I sent it and waited. The reply came back with apology, new terms, and a contract that respected my value. That exchange tasted different from victory in the past. It tasted like ownership of my time and labor. As my business grew, so did the life I provided for my son. I shielded him from the calculations and the late nights. To him, our home was simply a secure and loving space. I treasured the quiet ease of watching him sleep without the old, gnawing fear that tomorrow would reveal a shortage of resources. I took him to places I had only dreamed of as a child, and I invested in his opportunities with the same intensity I invested in my business. My primary aim was to rewrite inheritance, not of money alone, but of belief. I wanted him to grow up knowing that dignity and perseverance could shape a future. The most delicious aspect of success was not the numbers themselves, but the new psychology it allowed. There was an intoxicating clarity to observing my parents' continued self-assurance, while I quietly rearranged the levers of my life. They continued to present themselves as the caretakers, as people whose social polish signaled influence. They name-dropped, posted selective photographs, and accepted casual praise from relatives as if they were the authors of my achievements. Their performative affection, once a source of confusion and pain, slowly became the raw material for a different kind of triumph. I would let them speak, and I would move in silence, building a structure so sturdy that their words would be rendered irrelevant. By 28, the work had yielded undeniable results. What started modestly had become substantial, a multi-million-dollar enterprise in structure, not in the braggadocio of a fleeting headline. I held assets, rental properties that delivered steady cash flow, accounts with growing equity, and a consulting practice that sustained both income and reputation. Invitations came for speaking engagements that paid and mattered. Collaborations were offered by peers who respected craft over spectacle, and a network of other women entrepreneurs grew into a community of reciprocal support. In practical terms, I had enough to make choices without fear. In less tangible terms, I had reclaimed the narrative of my life. I began to conceive revenge, not as a moment, but as a discipline. I rejected loud public humiliation. The sweetest retribution would be quieter, subtle, immovable, and absolute. It would be about reallocating power, not inflicting pain. It would show up as boundaries that changed the calculus of what they could expect. I would not shout. I would simply shift the terrain until their old tactics no longer functioned. That strategy revealed itself in small, delicious ways. I would let them carry the story of my success in their social circles while I quietly strengthened the reality behind it. My mother would clip a magazine article with a proud smile and present it to friends as if she had been the architect of my path. She would boast, "Can you believe how well Natalie's doing?" And the ironic satisfaction that rose in me was ineffable. Yes, I was doing well, and she had no claim. When my parents phoned to ask for favors, an introduction, a small loan, a recommendation, I began to entertain the possibility of terms. Their arrogance had always presumed I was available on demand. Now I offered help on my own terms. Paid introductions, clearly defined repayment plans, or professional arrangements that respected my labor and reversed the assumed dynamic of charity. One such interaction remains vivid. My father called and hesitantly asked if I might speak with a business contact on his behalf. He framed it with humility, but entitlement was woven through the ask. I could have refused outright, or greeted the request as an opportunity for moral lecture. Instead, I proposed a professional solution. I would make the introduction, but would invoice him for my time and expertise, or accept a clear reciprocal favor. The pause on the other side of the line, then the reluctant acceptance, felt like a small recalibration of a lifetime of dynamics. They had to acknowledge that help came with value attached, that my labor was not a free commodity, because they once thought I was a child to be scolded or coddled. Family gatherings became a stage for these new dynamics. My mother would tilt her face toward me and say, with a possessive sweetness, "She's been doing so well." I learned to respond with an evenness that made the assertion sound quaint rather than consequential. I let her bask in the reflected light of my achievements, content to let the illusion of her influence persist so long as it did not translate into control. At times, they seemed genuinely proud. At times, they seemed to be rehabilitating their image through association with my success. Both outcomes were acceptable. I preferred to own my story while offering them a comfortable role that required no interference. There were times when the emotional hunger to expose them flared. Old songs or a whiff of a familiar perfume could fan the embers of resentment into a sharp ache. I would think back to 1,000 small omissions, birthday parties unattended, late calls ignored, a lack of presence when it mattered most. Sometimes I wrote those lists out in the margin of a notebook, not as a litany to unleash, but as a ledger of lessons. Each item on the list served as a reminder of what to avoid in my own life, and as a record of the resilience I had mustered. The moment when they asked me outright for meaningful help felt like arrival. They requested a favor with a humility that cut both ways, lesser prided by embarrassment, yet anchored in the assumption that my success made me their resource. I had choices. I could refuse and savor the sharpness of denial. I could accept and attempt to simulate magnanimity. Instead, I chose a third path. I offered support tethered to respect. I crafted terms that demanded accountability, dignity, and transparency, a loan with a repayment schedule, an introduction offered as a contractual engagement, assistance that transformed dependence into transaction. The act of helping under those terms was not cruelty. It was pedagogy. I taught them that compassion need not be confused with entitlement. Their reaction was a study in adjustment. They shifted uncomfortably at first to the new script. Pride, once automatic, had to be negotiated. Requests that once carried implicit leverage now required consent and reciprocity. Watching them learn to interact with me in a language of mutual respect rather than presumption was oddly satisfying, less for the sting of watching them recalibrate and more for the simple justice of establishing a healthier grammar between us. Life marched on. My business continued to scale in measured ways. New partnerships, curated product lines that resonated with customers, and advisory roles that allowed me to amplify other women's businesses. I invested in mentorship because I recognized the power of clear guidance at the precise moment it was needed. I invested in my son's future with deliberate acts of care, education, experiences, and the way I taught him to hold himself in the world. My boundaries tightened by necessity. I learned to say no in ways that protected my energy and advanced my goals. Looking back, I can see the strange alchemy of how abandonment became a teacher. The lack of support had been bitter, but it cultivated resourcefulness. What once felt like abandonment gradually revealed itself as an invitation to build systems that did not depend on anyone's approval. My parents, flawed, performative, sometimes unkind, had inadvertently shown me what not to accept. Their pattern of behavior presented a negative example that I could invert into a positive strategy. It would be dishonest to deny that revenge fueled me at times. The desire to be seen, to be respected, to prove that my struggle was not wasted, that was real. Yet the shape of my revenge transformed over time. Where it had once been a hot ember burning for immediate vindication, it mellowed into diligent ambition and careful generosity. The real victory was never in exposing them as small. It was in building a life so robust that their opinions could not alter its course. Of course, old impulses linger. Sometimes I would catch myself wanting a dramatic confrontation, a scene in which history was read aloud and humiliation served as catharsis. Those flashes passed quickly. They were satisfying in imagination, but messy and short-lived in life. The long game, steady gains, deliberate boundaries, and generosity administered on my own terms, yielded outcomes that were more lasting and, in their quiet way, more righteous. In quiet moments, when the apartment hushes and the evening light settles on the windowsill, I reflect on the patient labor that shaped this life. It was not only a series of business choices. It was a disciplined re-education of how I spoke to myself, how I translated fear into plans, and how I learned to recognize my own worth, even when others refused to. I began celebrating modest wins and treating setbacks as data rather than condemnation. I taught my son the practical alchemy of persistence, how to turn small, consistent actions into meaningful progress, and through example showed him the dignity of insisting on fairness. I learned to steward my time and energy, to protect joy as fiercely as I protected revenue, and to let generosity be a choice rather than a performance. Today, my parents occupy a place in my life that is quieter and more honest than before. They remain present in the rituals of family and in the occasional awkwardness of people who are learning to let go of old scripts. There is no grand cinematic moment of retribution, only the steady arc of a life arranged with intention. My success did not obliterate the past, but it altered my relationship to it. I no longer measure myself by their approval or perform gratitude to soothe their conscience. Instead, I measure myself by the strength of the life I build for my son, and by the clarity of the boundaries I keep. Power was not the spectacle I had imagined as a younger woman. It was less about striking back and more about building forward. The finest revenge, I discovered, is the slow construction of a reality where the past's small violences cannot find purchase. When they, of their own volition, came to me asking for help, they learned a new currency: accountability, reciprocity, and the knowing that favors could be offered without surrendering dignity. I had become the architect of my destiny and the gatekeeper of its terms. And that power, quiet and deliberate, proved to be the most satisfying triumph of all. The moment was approaching, the one I had envisioned in countless sleepless nights. My parents had underestimated me for decades, and now, with everything carefully planned, the stage was set. The revenge would be slow, deliberate, and utterly irreversible. And when it unfolded, they wouldn't just be disappointed, they would be utterly speechless. I remember the day they asked me for a favor, as if it were a wound that finally scabbed and then reopened with the same sharpness I had learned to carry for years. It arrived as a polite text, short, clipped, the kind of message that tried to seem casual but reeked faintly of fear, a subtle tremor disguised as civility. "Natalie," it read, "we need your help with a business connection. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow?" My thumb hovered over the screen. My heart beat a little faster. Not from anger, not from the urge to lash out, but from something colder, something steadier. The delicious knowledge that the people who once expelled me now had to come asking. Their tone implied humility, yet beneath it was the arrogant assumption that they were entitled to my time, my attention, my goodwill. They had never believed I could succeed enough to refuse them. I could have ignored the message, left it to linger unread. I could have ghosted them, leaving humiliation to gnaw at their pride like a silent predator. Instead, I typed a single sentence, measured and concise. "Sure. Noon. The Rosewood." "See you there." I chose the Rosewood carefully. It was public yet discreet, plush without being ostentatious. Exactly the sort of place where someone accustomed to status would feel comfortable, yet not in control. White tablecloths, crystal water glasses, the low hum of other diners pretending their own lives were more interesting than mine. I arrived early, selecting a dress that cost half what their mortgage probably did. Hair pulled back in a casual knot, minimal jewelry. Composure mattered more than spectacle. Part of the point of this meeting, I reminded myself, was to appear graceful, not vengeful. Elegance in victory is a weapon more subtle than anger. When they walked in, they were exactly as they had always been, surgically polite, impeccably dressed, posture taut with the practiced certainty of belonging. Relief softened their features when they saw me. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a napkin, betraying the tiniest flicker of anxiety. My father kept his jaw tight, like a man straining to contain a secret he was afraid might escape. "Thank you for meeting with us." "Dear," my mother said, voice smooth and polished, each syllable steeped in rehearsed warmth. Well, there's a family friend who is looking to invest, and they thought of you." I sipped my water slowly, tasting the cool mineral tang like patience distilled. "Tell me more," I said, neutral, detached, letting my calm mask the storm inside. They spoke in waves, names, vague deals, requests for introductions they assumed were within my modest social circle. I cataloged everything, taking mental notes while my mind raced 3 steps ahead, already plotting how to make this small meeting deliver consequences far beyond what they imagined. The favor they requested was minor: an introduction, a bridge to a contact they assumed I could grant effortlessly. Their presumption was natural to them. Their arrogance had always blinded them. What they did not understand was how much I had learned about leverage, optics, and power. A carefully placed introduction could shape perceptions, reputations, even fortunes, and I had already planned my response. "Of course," I said, measured, casual. "I can make the introduction, but I should be compensated for brokering the deal." My mother's smile faltered ever so slightly, a flicker of dissonance passing through her eyes. My father's gaze sharpened, as if I had just uttered blasphemy. "It's family," my mother protested, tone caught somewhere between a plea and a rebuke. "We're just asking. This is important to us." "Yes," my father interjected, too sharply, as if urgency could override principle. "We'd appreciate it if you did this for us, for old time's sake." "Old time's sake," I repeated, tasting the phrase like bitter chocolate. Nostalgia, weaponized to cloak entitlement, was almost tender in its audacity. "Let me be clear. If I'm arranging meetings, vetting contacts, and facilitating introductions at this level, there will be a fee. I don't work pro bono." The air thickened instantly. Outrage flickered across my father's features. How dare she demand payment? And resignation shadowed my mother's eyes. The old dynamic, the one they had relied on for years, was gone. The girl who once would have silently bowed, who would have endured, who would have swallowed indignities, had been replaced by someone entirely unrecognizable to them. A woman in control, calm and strategic. After hesitation, they agreed to a nominal compensation, enough to make the situation appear reasonable, but not enough to threaten the larger point. I smiled politely, made a mental note, and arranged the meeting through my assistant, keeping contact details private, requiring partial payment up front. Businesslike, clinical. Precisely the formality they hated. After the meeting, they left with visible relief, believing they had secured a favor while maintaining dignity. I, however, watched them with detached amusement, sensing their social currency had been quietly recalibrated. They had underestimated the cost of entitlement. Phase 1 of the plan was simple: explainable generosity. I wanted to appear reasonable, even gracious. I expanded the circle subtly, introducing them to a mid-tier investor hungry for access to networks with name recognition. I carefully vetted the investor, reviewed contracts, and prepared non-disclosure agreements. Every action appeared standard, professional. Every action was strategic. Phase 2, subtle leverage. While arranging the introduction, I embedded clauses that would favor me disproportionately: contingency fees, public recognition as the broker, and strategic clauses allowing disclosure in media. Every clause seemed reasonable on the surface. An untrained eye would see nothing unusual. But the framework ensured I was positioned as the indispensable pivot of the transaction. Phase 3, optics. I instructed my PR team to prepare a press release. Simple, neutral language. Natalie Thompson Consulting facilitates high-profile investor connection for local family trust. Transparent? Almost mundane. But a verifiable trail existed, from emails to invoices. The world would see my influence clearly, without any fabrication. They expected gratitude. They got an invoice, terms, and a draft of the press release sent to their inbox with a cheerful note. Excited to have been a bridge. Please see draft for press. Let me know if you'd like your names included. The note was like a spark in dry tinder. My mother called, voice tight. Natalie, darling, why would you include us in a press release? We were just asking a small favor. This is going a bit far. You asked for help. I provided a service. Public recognition seemed appropriate. I replied evenly, savoring the tension. But we didn't... She started, then stopped. I could almost hear her scrambling to adjust to reality. The exposure she had ignored for decades now made unavoidable. My father remained silent, his fury restrained only by his need to appear composed. From that moment, the dominoes began to fall, quietly, elegantly, with the precision of a chess player who never reveals the next move. The investor was delighted with the clarity of the introduction. Contracts progressed smoothly. My invoices were paid on schedule. The press release went live, naming me as the facilitator. Local business blogs picked up the story, fascinated by a woman who had built herself from nothing, now bridging old money and new opportunities. My parents' names appeared in the story because they had requested inclusion, a subtle public acknowledgement of their connection, ostensibly to show family unity. Hypocrisy cloaked as pride, exposed to the world. Next came the board invitation. A small nonprofit, previously supported by my parents, planned an event and invited them to speak about family values and philanthropy. I volunteered to sponsor the event, under the guise of goodwill. My sponsorship documents included clauses demanding pre-event press releases and public rosters. On the day of the event, the press release subtly referenced the prior deal my parents had asked me to facilitate. Their speeches about family values collided with headlines linking them to a daughter they had abandoned. Cameras flashed. Whispered comments buzzed. Even longtime acquaintances avoided eye contact. Then, the legal nudge. An anonymous tip to a local tax advisor initiated routine audits. Nothing criminal, just scrutiny of sloppy accounting, old tax write-offs, and charitable contributions missing documentation. My parents, whose social currency depended on immaculate appearances, were forced to confront their gaps. While the audits were procedural, for them, they felt public, inescapable. I remained detached. No gossip, no raised voice. I issued statements only when required, emphasizing transparency and pride in my work. Journalists noted the contrast. A self-made woman, ethical and measured, versus parents whose reputations were suddenly fragile. The narrative emerged effortlessly, exposing my parents' absence while highlighting my resilience. Finally, the dinner, the family gathering I had awaited. A small celebration organized by my aunt, designed to show unity. I accepted the invitation. It was essential that the final act unfold before witnesses. The room was flawless, pastel perfection. Crystal, polished cutlery, flowers carefully arranged. My parents sat opposite, eyes wary, proud, convinced their presence could reclaim authority. They mentioned my success between courses, attempting to link it to their values. I listened. Plates clinked. Words sounded hollow. Inside, old memories stirred, fear, anxiety, longing. Then resolve returned. Steel beneath warmth, dessert arrived. Lemon tart delicate. I stood. The room quieted. Forks paused midair. I smiled at the faces around the table. I want to thank everyone for coming, I began, voice steady. I hear you when you speak of family, values, and pride. I am proud of my work, proud of the company I've built. But I want to clarify one thing. Nothing I have now is because of you. I did not get here with your help. I got here in spite of your absence. I worked nights, studied, and sacrificed. I never asked for pity, but I expected honesty. Steel beneath calm. Eyes widened. My mother's neck flushed. My father's jaw tensed. Conversations froze. And while I appreciate your pride, I continued, I will not be used to enhance your image. Celebrate me authentically. Tell people how you were absent and what you learned. Don't pretend to have helped. That is the honesty I ask for." A family member, long observing silently, spoke. "I don't think anyone is denying Natalie's work. But when we talk about pride, we should acknowledge who helped and who hurt. It matters. Acknowledgement." Ledger entry made public. The room shifted irreversibly. Conversations thinned. My parents' authority fractured quietly but irrevocably. Afterward, whispers circulated. Some relatives privately praised me. Others sent sympathetic messages to my parents. Invitations diminished. Social circles subtly realigned. Their curated reputation, once untouchable, was exposed to scrutiny. Months later, a board seat resignation followed. One of their charitable appointments, previously a pillar of social prestige, stepped down, citing personal reasons, consequences of the narrative shift I had engineered. Social influence dwindled. Polite distance replaced warmth. Their world rerouted around them. I did not revel in cruelty. Instead, I savored clarity. I had endured poverty, humiliation, and abandonment. I had cried in the dark. Quietly, strategically, I had reclaimed my narrative, establishing autonomy without malice. Months later, my mother texted, "We should talk." I replied, "I'm willing to meet. I want honest conversation, not apologies crafted for audiences. If you want to discuss the past, I'll listen, but I won't pretend it didn't happen." We met in a quiet cafe, free from the performance of family gatherings. My son was elsewhere. My mother's eyes were red, genuine, not theatrical. My father's jaw worked as though chewing words he couldn't say. "We were young," my mother began. "You made a choice," I said softly. "You chose image over me. You chose reputation over helping your daughter raise her child." They struggled. Words faltered. There was sorrow, but not transformation. Not yet, and that was enough. I did not need absolution. I needed acknowledgement, honesty, a reckoning with truth. We parted with a fragile truce. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but recognition. My son sat with me that evening as I taught him about boundaries, strength without malice, and the way people sometimes fail in the ways that matter most. Life continued. My empire expanded, resilient, independent. My parents existed in it as peripheral figures, finally seen for who they were. Flawed humans who had made damaging choices, forced to live with the consequences. Social media tags capture them now. Carefully curated philanthropy, rehearsed smiles. Sometimes I feel sympathy, sometimes nothing. Mostly I feel the steady warmth of a life fully my own, built for me and my son, a life that no one can take away. Victory had come not in public spectacle, not in shaming, but in the quiet, unassailable act of building a life where past injuries could no longer dictate the present. The circle was closed. Power, patience, and precision had rendered the narrative mine entirely. As I sit here now, looking back on everything, I realize something profound. Revenge is not just a moment. It's a lifetime of choices. It's the small decisions you make every day, the hours you spend learning, working, and building while the world doubts you. It's the moments when you feel broken, exhausted, and invisible, and yet you keep moving forward anyway. That, more than any confrontation, any humiliating exposure, is the true power. I often think about my son. He will grow up in a world where he knows that his mother never gave up, that she refused to let other people dictate her value, and that resilience can be louder than any voice of judgment. That is the legacy I wanted to leave. Not bitterness, not anger, but an unshakable foundation of self-worth and integrity. And somehow by doing that, the universe allowed me to serve a kind of quiet justice to the people who doubted me most. There were times in those dark years when I thought about what it would feel like to strike back aggressively, to yell, to humiliate. But as I built my life, I realized the most exquisite revenge doesn't roar, it whispers. It moves quietly, steadily, elegantly. It's in showing the world you were right about yourself when everyone else was wrong. It's in seeing your parents, who once dismissed you, reduced to witnesses of your triumph rather than participants. The irony is intoxicating, yes, but so much sweeter because it's earned, meticulous and unassailable. Even now, years later, I still receive messages from people who were in similar situations. Single mothers, abandoned children, people crushed by the weight of expectation and betrayal. They tell me that my story inspired them to rise, to fight, to reclaim their lives. That, more than anything else, makes the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, and the relentless struggle worthwhile. The vengeance I enacted wasn't just about my parents. It was about proving, to myself and the world, that injustice could be met with strength, dignity, and calculated action. I sometimes wonder what my parents feel when they think about those years. Do they remember the nights I cried alone, the endless work, the struggle to feed and clothe my son? Do they regret abandoning me? Maybe. Or maybe they simply live with a quiet discomfort that no amount of social polish can erase. That discomfort, the realization that I thrived while they merely pretended to care, is a subtle, almost invisible victory, but one that lingers far longer than any shout or confrontation ever could. And me? I carry no hatred now. There is a peace in knowing that I played the long game, that I lived well, that I built something magnificent from nothing. Every deal, every success, every quiet moment of triumph is a reminder that resilience is its own reward. The people who once tried to bury me in shame are now part of a larger story, one in which they are observers, while I am the architect of my own destiny. So if you're listening to this, if you've ever felt powerless, abandoned, or underestimated, remember this: the ultimate revenge is not in tearing others down, it is in rising. It is in building, in excelling, in claiming a life so full, so undeniable, that anyone who doubted you cannot help but acknowledge it. Silently, helplessly, and finally. That is the kind of justice that echoes for a lifetime. When I look at my son, I see the future I fought for. I see the proof that pain can be transformed into power, that neglect can be countered with perseverance, and that the people who try to define you without compassion will ultimately be left behind. That is the triumph. That is the satisfaction. And that is the story I want him, and anyone listening, to carry with them always. Because some revenge isn't loud. Some revenge doesn't involve confrontation or spectacle. Sometimes the sweetest, most devastating revenge is simply living so well, so fully and so triumphantly, that those who doubted you are left speechless, powerless, and most importantly, irrelevant. If there is one lesson I want you to take from my story, it is this: revenge, when it is moral and measured, is not about spectacle. It is about creating a life so honest, so full of integrity and accomplishment, that those who once judged you by their narrow standards are left to confront their own choices. There is no joy in seeing someone suffer for the sake of pain. The true victory is the one that lets you sleep at night, that lets your child grow up without the weight of shame, that gives you the freedom to look at your past honestly and say, I chose myself, and I chose well. I am not proud of making my parents uncomfortable. I am proud of building a life that my son and I can be proud of. I am proud of the way I learned to turn pain into fuel, humiliation into strategy, abandonment into relentless determination. The world is complicated. People are complicated. But there is a kind of justice that doesn't need to shout, only to exist steadily, undeniably, and beautifully. If this story moved you, please hit like and subscribe. There are more true tales of betrayal, grit, and quiet justice waiting. Share this video with someone who needs to know they can rise without apologies. And I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city and local time in the comments below. Let's build a map of resilience together. Thank you for listening to my story. Stay strong, live honestly, fight quietly, and when you win, do it with grace.